The morning it happened, I wore my gray blazer. The one I always wear when I close a deal. I had just closed the biggest deal in Hartwell & Crane's history, and I thought, foolishly it turns out, that someone was finally going to acknowledge that. My name is Renata Solís. I was the Senior Vice President of Client Strategy at Hartwell & Crane Group. I had held that title and the weight that came with it for 19 years. 19 years of early flights and late calls. 19 years of sitting across from procurement teams in boardrooms and skeptical executives, talking them into staying. 19 years of building something real for a company that had learned very quickly how to take what I built and call it theirs. That Tuesday morning in October, I was called into the office of our CEO Nolan Freed. Freed had been with the firm for 8 months. He came from private equity. Before Hartwell & Crane, he had spent his career buying companies, cutting costs and flipping them for a profit. He was 44 years old, well-dressed, and very good at making you feel like you were part of a conversation he had already finished having without you. The board brought him in through a restructuring process the previous spring. I had watched him in those first months the way you watch a new neighbor. Quietly paying attention to the small things. What he asked about. What he did not ask about. Who he had lunch with and who he did not. I walked into his office that morning expecting a raise. 3 weeks earlier, I had signed the largest client renewal in Hartwell & Crane's history. A $14.2 million multi-year contract with Daxco Industrial. Our anchor account, our most complex client, the name on the top of every revenue projection the firm had ever made. I had managed Daxco for 11 of my 19 years. I had personally saved that account 3 times from cancellation. The renewal I had just closed would carry the firm for the next 4 years. I sat down across from Freed. He smiled, that particular smile that does not reach the eyes, and slid a letter across the desk toward me. He said it was a compensation review. He said the firm was making some structural changes to how it handled SVP-level pay. He said words like equity, and standardization, and alignment. He said all of this in a calm, even tone, the way someone reads from a script they have rehearsed but do not fully believe. I picked up the letter and read it. My annual performance bonus. The $40,000 I had received every single year for the past 9 years, tied directly to client retention metrics that I had exceeded every single year, had been reclassified. The letter called it non-guaranteed variable pay. For this cycle it had been reduced to 0. Not reduced. Eliminated. The justification was a new firm-wide compensation equity initiative. The language was smooth and bureaucratic and completely hollow. I set the letter down on the edge of his desk. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask a question I did not already know the answer to. I looked at Freed and I understood in that moment exactly what was happening. This was not about equity. This was not about standardization. Freed was trimming senior compensation to make the firm's financials look cleaner. Leaner payroll, better margins, a more attractive profile for whoever was being brought in to look at the books. He was building a sale. And I was a line item he had decided to shrink. He asked me if I had any questions. I said, no. I think this is very clear. I thanked him for his time. I stood up, straightened my blazer and walked out. I remember the hallway feeling very long that morning. I remember walking past the framed revenue charts on the wall. Charts that showed a company growing steadily year over year for nearly 2 decades. Charts that told a story of momentum and client loyalty and strategic growth. Charts that did not have my name on them anywhere. What Nolan Freed did not know, what he could not have known because he had never bothered to find out, was that I had spent 19 years building something inside that company that no compensation letter could reclassify. And I had the documents to prove every single piece of it. He thought he had handed me a loss. He had no idea he had just handed me a reason. People who have never worked in client strategy think the job is about being friendly. About taking people to dinners and sending holiday gifts and being good on the phone. And yes, those things matter. But that is not what the job actually is. The job is architecture. You build something invisible and enormous. You build systems of trust and dependency that hold up an entire business. You learn what a client's real fears are, not the ones they say out loud in meetings but the ones underneath. The fear of disruption, the fear of being blamed, the fear of making the wrong decision in front of their own leadership. And then you make yourself the person who removes those fears, consistently over years. When you do that long enough, you do not just manage an account. You become structurally embedded in it. You become load-bearing. At Hartwell & Crane, I was load-bearing in ways that did not show up anywhere on an org chart. Over 19 years, I had personally negotiated the service-level agreements for 8 of the firm's top enterprise accounts. I had designed the internal delivery model that every client-facing team still used, the escalation protocols, the reporting cadence, the onboarding framework. And I was the named escalation contact in 6 active client contracts. That last part matters. It is not just a title. It means that legally, operationally, and in the plain language of those contracts, those clients had a formal relationship with me. Not with the firm in the abstract. With me specifically. The Daxco relationship was the most embedded of all. I flew to their headquarters in Detroit every quarter for 7 years. I knew their procurement team, their operations leadership, their legal department. I had sat in their conference rooms during budget cuts and leadership changes and 2 full executive transitions. I had talked them through crises that never made it into any report at Hartwell and Crane because I had resolved them quietly before they became visible. The $14.2 million contract I had just renewed was not the result of a pitch deck or a sales strategy. It was the result of 11 years of trust built in very small, very consistent, very personal increments. That was what Freed had decided was not worth $40,000. And here's what made it worse. I was not the only one. That same week. The same week Freed handed me that letter. 2 other women at the firm received nearly identical compensation adjustments. Both of them were senior level. Both of them had been at Hartwell and Crane for over a decade. Both of them, like me, held long-term client relationships that the firm depended on. Both of them had their variable pay reclassified under the same firm-wide initiative language. At the same time, 2 SVPs who had been hired within the past 2 years, both men, both brought in under Freed, received retention bonuses. Not restructured. Not reclassified. Bonuses. I am not someone who reaches for easy explanations. But I am also not someone who ignores a pattern when it is sitting directly in front of her. I went home that evening and I went to my home office and I opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. Inside that drawer was a folder I had been keeping for years. Not because I had ever planned to use it, but because I had learned somewhere in my first few years in corporate life that documentation is not paranoia. It is professionalism. It is the difference between having a case and just having a feeling. That folder had my original employment agreement. It had copies of every client contract I had negotiated. It had emails, memos, performance reviews, and records going back nearly 2 decades. I set it on my desk and I opened it. And that was the night everything changed. I have always believed that the most dangerous thing in any business is a document nobody bothered to read carefully. Companies sign agreements, file them away, and forget them. Years pass. Leadership changes. The people who negotiated the original terms retire or move on. And the documents sit there, quiet and patient, holding language that nobody remembers agreeing to. Until one day someone needs to remember. That night, sitting at my desk with that folder open in front of me, I found 3 things that would change everything. The first was in my own employment agreement. My original contract with Hartwell and Crane had been signed 19 years ago, when the firm was a quarter of its current size and I was 31 years old and just starting to understand what I was capable of. That contract had never been formally replaced. There had been title changes over the years, salary adjustments, updated job descriptions. But the foundational employment agreement, the one with the signatures on the last page, had never been superseded by a new document. And inside that original agreement was a clause about my annual performance bonus. It did not use the word discretionary, the way Freed's new compensation letter did. The clause tied my bonus directly to client retention metrics. It used specific language that described the bonus as earned compensation upon meeting defined performance thresholds. I had met those thresholds every year for 9 consecutive years. Every single year. I called my employment attorney the next morning. Her name is Lorraine Achebi and I have known her for 12 years. I sent her the original contract and the new compensation letter side by side. She read both and called me back within 2 hours. She told me that the retroactive reclassification of my bonus, reframing earned compensation as non-guaranteed variable pay without a new signed agreement, may constitute a material breach of my original contract. She said the word may because she is careful and precise. But her tone told me she was confident. That was the first thing. The second was in the Daxco service agreement. I pulled the full contract, the current one, the $14.2 million renewal I had just signed, and I read through it with fresh eyes. Near the back, in a section titled Operational Continuity, was a clause I had helped draft during an earlier contract negotiation. At the time, Daxco had insisted on it. They wanted protection against service disruption if key personnel changed. I had agreed to it on the firm's behalf because it seemed reasonable, and because I had never imagined it would become relevant. The clause stated that if Daxco's named escalation contact was removed from the account or left the firm without 60 days of written notice and a mutually agreed transition plan, Daxco had the right to trigger an early exit review of the entire contract. In plain language, if I left or if the firm tried to push me off the account, Daxco could legally reopen the entire $14.2 million agreement and walk away from it. I read that clause 3 times. Then I sat back in my chair and I was quiet for a long moment. The third discovery came from a phone call. A former colleague of mine, a woman I had worked closely with years ago who had since moved into the firm's finance department, reached out to me that same week. Carefully. She did not put anything in writing. She called me from her personal phone and spoke in the measured, deliberate way of someone who knows exactly what they are risking by making contact. She told me that Hartwell & Crane was in active acquisition discussions with a private equity firm called Greyline Capital. Not preliminary conversations. Active due diligence. Greyline had been reviewing the firm's financials and operations for 6 weeks. Their evaluation was built around the firm's 3 largest accounts, Daxco being the most significant, which were being presented to Greyline as stable, locked, long-term revenue. Fried had assured Greyline that those accounts were secure. I thanked her. I ended the call. I sat very still. Fried had told Greyline the accounts were secure. But the largest of those accounts had a clause that made my continued presence a contractual requirement. And I was the only person in that building who knew both of those things at the same time. I closed the folder. I made copies of everything and stored them in 2 separate places. And I began to think very carefully about what came next. The most important decision I made in those first days was also the hardest one. I decided not to react. Not yet. I went to work the next Monday morning the same way I had gone to work every Monday morning for 19 years. I answered emails. I sat in meetings. I updated client reports. I smiled in the hallway at the people who had no idea what I was carrying. I gave Fried no signal. No coldness, no distance, no change in my professional behavior. As far as anyone watching could tell, I had accepted the compensation change and moved on. I had not moved on. I was building. The first thing I did was retain Lorraine formally. I paid the retainer, signed the engagement letter and gave her everything. My original employment contract, the new compensation letter, the Daxco service agreement, and the full paper trail of my bonus history going back 9 years. She began reviewing it in detail. The second thing I did was send a written request to HR. I kept the letter polite and professional. I said I wanted to understand the legal and contractual basis for the compensation restructuring, and I asked for documentation supporting the firm-wide initiative that had been referenced in my revised letter. I sent it through email so the timestamp was automatic. I was not aggressive. I simply asked in writing for an explanation. HR responded 10 days later with a memo. The memo restated the firm-wide initiative language, referenced a general policy update, and provided no contractual basis whatsoever. When I forwarded it to Lorraine, she told me the response was legally insufficient. It did not address the original contract clause. It did not provide any documentation. It was, in her words, a non-answer designed to look like an answer. She noted this formally in her file. The third thing I did was reach out to my 2 colleagues. I did not call a meeting. I did not send emails. I spoke to each of them separately, in person, in brief and careful conversations that could not be misread. I told them what I had found in my original contract. I told them they should pull their own agreements and read them carefully. I told them to start documenting everything, every communication about the compensation change, every meeting, every memo. I told them the pattern I had seen was worth taking seriously. I did not promise them anything. I simply made sure they were not standing in the dark. The fourth thing I did was make sure Paula Nwachukwu still knew she could count on me. Paula was Daxco's head of procurement. She was the woman I had worked most closely with over the past 5 years. Sharp, direct, deeply experienced, and someone who had staked her own internal credibility on the stability of our relationship. I did not tell her anything about what was happening at Hartwell & Crane. I simply did what I always did. I called her to follow up on a detail from the renewal. I responded to her team's questions faster than anyone expected. I stayed visible and reliable and present. Because Paula's trust in me was not just professional goodwill. It was, at this point, one of the most valuable assets I had. The fifth thing I did was write what I privately called my exit package. It was not a resignation letter. It was a document for my own use. A detailed inventory of everything I controlled that the firm could not easily replace. Every client relationship. Every undocumented process. Every internal system I had built or maintained. Every place where my departure would create an operational gap. I was methodical about it. I used specific numbers wherever I could. When I finished the document, I added up the annual recurring revenue associated with the accounts that depended directly on my involvement. The number was $31 million. $31 million in annual revenue sitting on a foundation that Fried had just decided was worth cutting by $40,000. And around the same time, through that same board-level contact I had carefully cultivated over years of quiet, consistent relationship building, I learned one more thing. The board had been told the senior compensation changes were voluntary restructuring. That the affected employees had been consulted and had agreed to the new terms. That was not what happened. I wrote that down too. 6 weeks into my preparation, Nolan Fried made his second major mistake. It happened on a Wednesday morning. We were in the main conference room for what had been billed as a leadership alignment meeting. About 40 people, all SVP level and above, gathered around the long table or standing along the walls. These meetings happen once a quarter. They were usually full of slides about revenue targets and operational updates and whatever initiative Fried's team had decided to prioritize that cycle. I had my notebook in front of me. I had a coffee I had barely touched. I was waiting. About 20 minutes in, Fried moved to a new slide. He called it the Client Excellence Initiative. He spoke about the importance of enterprise relationships and long-term account growth and something he called relationship architecture. He used that phrase, relationship architecture, without any awareness of the irony. Then he clicked to the next slide and said he was excited to announce that Perry Oakes would be stepping into a newly created role, Head of Enterprise Client Relations. Perry would be taking responsibility for all of the firm's top-tier accounts, including Daxco. I had not been told. Not a conversation, not an email, not a 5-minute heads-up before the meeting. I found out at the same time as everyone else in that room. 40 colleagues watching my face as my largest account, the one I had spent 11 years building, was handed to someone else in a PowerPoint slide. I kept my face completely still. I made a small note in my notebook. I did not look up. Perry Oakes was 34 years old. He had joined Hartwell and Crane 14 months earlier from a smaller regional agency. He was personable and well-presented and reasonably bright. He was also not named in a single client contract. He had never managed an account above a certain revenue threshold. And he had no existing relationship with Paula Nwachukwu or anyone else on Daxco's senior leadership team. What I learned later that afternoon, through a colleague who had been copied on some internal emails, was that Perry had already made contact with Daxco. Not with Paula. Not with anyone in procurement or leadership. He had reached out to 2 mid-level contacts in Daxco's operations team, framing it as an introduction, keeping it informal. It appeared someone at Hartwell and Crane had decided the way to transition the account without triggering the 60-day clause was to make the introduction feel casual. To slip Perry in through a side door before anyone realized the front door had rules. The problem was that I had already closed that side door. Several weeks earlier, in one of my regular calls with Paula, I had mentioned, carefully, naturally, as part of a broader conversation about communication preferences, that any personnel or structural changes on the Hartwell and Crane side should come directly through me. Paula had agreed without hesitation. She preferred it that way. She had always preferred it that way. That same Wednesday afternoon, Paula called me. She did not call Perry's office. She did not call Fried. She called me directly on my cell phone the way she always had. She said the communication coming from Hartwell and Crane had felt a little inconsistent lately. She said one of her operations contacts had mentioned being contacted by someone new, and she wanted to know if everything was okay on our end. I told her everything was completely under control. I told her she had my direct line as always and that nothing had changed on my end. He said good. She said she was glad to hear it. After I hung up, I sat in my car in the parking garage for a few minutes. Fried had tried to move me off the account quietly, carefully, without triggering the contract clause. He had tried to use a side entrance that he did not realize I had already locked. He had failed. And Greyline Capital's due diligence window was now down to 9 weeks. After Paula's call, I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. The first was that Daxco's loyalty was still with me, personally, specifically and actively. Not with the firm's logo or its new org chart or Perry Oaks and his introduction emails. With me. The second was that I was running out of time to be patient. I called Lorraine. I asked her one specific question. If I resigned from Hartwell and Crane and immediately set up an independent consulting entity, was there anything in my contract that would legally prevent me from working with Daxco directly? She pulled up my non-compete clause and reviewed it carefully. It had been written 19 years ago in the language and the geography of a firm that was, at the time, a regional operation serving a handful of mid-sized clients in the Midwest. The clause covered direct solicitation of Hartwell and Crane clients within the consulting and managed services space. But 2 things made it weak. The first was a geographic limitation written into the original language, a boundary that reflected where the firm operated in its early years and had never been updated as the firm expanded nationally. The second was the nature of the situation itself. Lorraine explained that non-compete clauses, particularly older ones, are generally most enforceable when the former employee initiates contact to pull clients away. When a client chooses to follow an employee independently, when the movement comes from the client's side, enforceability becomes significantly harder to argue, particularly in a situation where the employee had been subject to a potential contract breach. Her assessment: the non-compete as written was likely unenforceable in this specific situation. I said thank you. I asked her to put that opinion in writing. I did not contact Daxco. Not yet. But I opened a new document on my laptop and I started drafting a service proposal. A structure for what it would look like if Daxco worked with me directly, not through Hartwell and Crane's layered overhead and executive billing rates, but through a lean-focused boutique practice built specifically around the kind of work I actually did. The pricing I modeled was significantly more competitive than what the firm currently charged, because I would not be carrying the weight of a management layer that had stopped adding value some time ago. I did not rush it. I wrote it carefully, revised it twice, and saved it in a folder I kept off the firm's internal systems. At the same time, Lorraine moved on the legal front. She sent a formal demand letter to Hartwell and Crane's general counsel. The letter was precise and well documented. It cited the specific clause in my original employment agreement, outlined the 9-year history of bonus payments tied to client retention performance, and formally requested $40,000 in back compensation along with written documentation of the legal basis for the restructuring. The letter was also copied, deliberately, carefully, to the board chair. That copy mattered. Until that letter arrived, the board's involvement in the compensation situation had been second-hand. They had been told the changes were voluntary. They had no reason to question it. But now there was a formal legal dispute in writing from a named SVP during active acquisition due diligence. That was not a rumor. That was a document they were required to take seriously. I was told later, through my board contact, that the firm's general counsel went to Fried immediately after receiving the letter and told him the timing was dangerous. That a compensation dispute going on record during a Greyline review created exposure the firm could not afford. Fried's response, according to my contact, was to wave it off. He called it a nuisance filing. He said it would go nowhere. He said it like someone who had never once considered that the person on the other side of that letter had 19 years of patience and nothing left to lose. 4 weeks before Greyline Capital's due diligence window closed, Paula called me again. This time her voice was different. Not panicked. Paula was never panicked. But there was a careful, measured quality to the way she spoke that told me she had thought about this call before making it. She had chosen her words. She told me that Daxco's leadership had formally raised an internal concern about account stability at Hartwell and Crane. She said that Perry Oaks had contacted her procurement committee directly, not through her, bypassing the channel she had specifically asked to be kept in place, and had presented what he called a relationship continuity plan. A document outlining how Daxco's account would be managed going forward. A document that did not mention my name once. Paula said her CEO had seen the document. He had read it, set it down, and asked Paula one direct question. Was Renata Solís still the person running this account? Paula told him she was not sure. He told me she was not sure. I had spent 11 years making sure Paula never had a reason to feel uncertain about anything connected to our work together. And now, because of a continuity plan written by someone who had been at the firm for 14 months, she was uncertain. That was the moment. Not the envelope on Fried's desk. Not the all-hands meeting where Perry's name appeared on a slide. This moment, Paula's voice on the phone, careful and honest, telling me she was not sure. This was the moment I decided to move. I asked her for 48 hours. She said she could give me that. I hung up and I called Lorraine. I told her I was ready. I asked her to finalize the incorporation documents for the entity we had discussed, Solís Strategy Group. She had already prepared the framework. Within 24 hours, the entity existed on paper, registered, with a business account opened and a service agreement template ready to use. I had my proposal for Daxco already drafted. I had been refining it quietly for weeks. Then I called Paula back. I did not tell her about Fried or the bonus or the legal dispute or any of it. That was not her problem to carry, and I was not going to put her in the middle of someone else's corporate mess. What I told her was this. I was launching an independent practice. I had spent 19 years building the kind of client work I was most proud of, and I had decided the time was right to do it on my own terms. And the first call I made, before I told anyone else, before I had even announced it publicly, was to her. Because Daxco had always been my priority and that was not going to change. I told her I wanted to propose a direct engagement. Leaner structure. More direct access. Pricing that reflected the absence of a large firm's overhead. And me personally as the primary lead, not a named contact on a contract that someone else managed from 3 steps removed. Me actually doing the work the way I always had. Paula listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she said she wanted to bring it to her CEO. She brought it to him within 24 hours. He approved it in principle within 48. Subject to formal legal review, which Daxco's legal team moved through quickly, given that they were already familiar with the contract structure I used and comfortable with the continuity clause implications. Daxco was coming with me. Then I wrote my resignation letter. It was 1 page. It was clean and professional and precise. It cited, in formal terms, the breach of my original employment agreement as grounds for immediate resignation. It did not use emotional language. It did not make accusations it could not support. It simply stated the facts, referenced the specific clause, and noted that a formal legal demand had already been submitted through counsel. I sent it to Fried. I copied the board chair. I copied the firm's general counsel. And then, through Lorraine, I sent a separate document to the lead partner at Greyline Capital. Not a letter full of grievances. A single, factual, carefully worded note informing them that a material change in the client relationship structure affecting the firm's largest account was currently underway, and that this change would have direct implications for the revenue projections they had been provided during due diligence. It was documented. It was accurate. It was devastating. I poured myself a coffee. I sat down at my kitchen table. I had barely taken the second sip when my phone lit up with a call from a number I recognized as Hartwell and Crane's main executive line. I let it ring. I want to be clear about something before I tell you how this ends. I did not enjoy watching Hartwell and Crane fall apart. I had given 19 years to that company. There were people inside those walls who had worked hard and done nothing wrong, and whatever happened to the firm's numbers in the months that followed affected them too. I do not celebrate that. I never did. What I celebrate is this. I made a decision based on preparation, not emotion. And it worked exactly the way careful preparation is supposed to work. 3 weeks after my resignation, Daxco Industrial signed a 2-year contract with Solís Strategy Group. The contract value was $9.8 million. Smaller than the Hartwell and Crane arrangement as it should be, because I was now a boutique practice without a large firm's infrastructure costs. But the margins were significantly better. And the structure was cleaner. Fewer layers, faster decisions, direct access. Paula told me in the call where we confirmed the final terms, that her CEO had described the new arrangement as what the relationship should have looked like years ago. I wrote that down. I kept it. 30 days after my resignation, a second Hartwell and Crane enterprise client reached out to me. This was a company whose account I had also managed for years. A relationship that had always run through me even when it technically sat under someone else's name on the internal org chart. Their procurement lead sent me a message asking if I was taking on new clients. I told them I would be happy to have a conversation. We scheduled a call for the following week. 4 weeks after my resignation, Greyline Capital formally withdrew from the acquisition of Hartwell and Crane. Their withdrawal letter cited, in the careful language that private equity firms use when they want to be accurate but not inflammatory, material uncertainty in enterprise client retention as a primary factor in their decision. My board contact, the person who had quietly kept me informed throughout all of this, sent me a photograph of the relevant paragraph. I read it once, closed the image and did not look at it again. I did not need to. 6 weeks after the acquisition collapsed, Nolan Freed resigned from Hartwell and Crane. The board did not issue a public statement explaining his departure. There was a brief internal announcement and then silence. Perry Oaks was reassigned to a mid-market portfolio. The firm's revenue figures for the following quarter reflected, in precise and unambiguous numbers, what it cost to misunderstand who was holding things together. I heard all of this through people I trusted. I did not seek it out. I was busy. My 2 colleagues, the women who had received the same restructured compensation letters that same week I did, were still inside the firm when all of this unfolded. I had stayed in contact with both of them through everything. Once I was out, I referred them to Lorraine. She reviewed their original employment agreements, found similar language to what had been in mine, and filed a formal compensation discrimination complaint on their behalf. That process was ongoing. I will not speak to its outcome here because it is not mine to speak to. But they were no longer standing in that situation without support. That mattered to me more than most of what happened. I am sitting at my desk as I tell you this story. It is a small office. I leased it myself, chose it myself, put a single plant on the windowsill and a signed copy of the Daxco contract in a frame on the wall. Not because I need to see it every day, but because of what it represents. It represents the Tuesday morning in October when Nolan Freed slid an envelope across his desk and called it a compensation review. When he looked at 19 years of work and decided it was worth $0 extra. When he smiled and thought that was the end of the conversation. I think about that morning sometimes. Not with anger. The anger burned off a long time ago. What I feel now is something quieter and more useful. I did not leave Hartwell and Crane because I was furious. I left because I was ready. I had the documents. I had the relationships. I had the clause nobody thought to read and the client nobody thought to ask about and the contract nobody thought I would ever use. I left prepared. And preparation. Real preparation, the kind that takes years and patience and the discipline to stay quiet when every part of you wants to speak. That is the only kind of revenge that lasts.